We'll go through the petition, and I think we'll be almost on time, but we'll keep an eye on any other questions that come in. If there's any other questions, we'll pick them up. We won't be able a chance to bring people in, but we'll try and answer any questions that come up. But shall I run through the petition, Steve?
Yeah, please, Paul. Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
So what we wanted to do was tell you the story of this petition, because it had an evolution. We were going through the report, we were picking up all of the practical actions that people had mentioned. And like I said earlier, there were things that we can do, we can all do, families can do, communities can do, businesses can do, organizations can do, sectors can do. We've had somebody, I noticed, from the construction sector in here tonight, which is great. You know, so all these things we can do. But there's things we need government to do. There's things we need Parliament to do. There's things we need in terms of a legal and regulatory framework, an accountability framework, an action learning, a national action learning framework. And this is how we're going to get the systems changed. So we thought, okay, we'll put together proposals for a Suicide Prevention Act. And we've studied around the world, you know, where there's some legislation in Canada, there's an act in Japan, there's South Australia has a Suicide Prevention Act. Not many of these countries have suicide prevention enshrined in legislation, but it does exist, and we've been able to look at it. And recently, we've had a remarkable breakthrough in Indonesia, where they've got suicide prevention now enshrined in their legislation and in their systems. And Steve and I met up with the guy who facilitated that entire process, so we know the story behind how they got there and the benefits of that for Indonesia. So we then thought petitions, and we thought, okay, the Three Dads example has been great. We've followed their story right from the beginning. We've been alongside them all the way. We followed them into Parliament. We watched the evidence hearing. We watched the Westminster Hall debate. We've seen them interact with MPs. They've got 150,000 signatures. We know this can be done, obviously with massive public profile. But then the Learn Network put forward their petition for a statutory duty of care for higher education institutions. And again, did a fantastic job, amazing job, 128,000 signatures, and we're learning from them as well, and got the evidence hearing. They got the debate. It was a slightly different evidence hearing and a slightly different debate for various reasons, but you know, we learned a lot from that experience. And even if they didn't support the actual specific proposal in there, the MPs, they supported the Three Dads. Most MPs supported the Three Dads broadly in terms of suicide education and the curriculum, but there were a few who were against the idea of a statutory duty of care for universities, and the universities were giving evidence and suggesting that they didn't need it, which we can't, no surprise that universities didn't think they needed it, and we're arguing about bureaucracy, red tape, etc. So there's pushback on that, but Lee and the team there had the opportunity to argue the case, and even if they don't get the statutory duty, it raised a number of issues about how to reduce suicides in universities, because there's around 100 university students take their own lives each year, and it also made the universities up their game as well. So the universities were giving evidence in Parliament and saying, oh, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing the other. And when they were challenged and said, okay, do you think that if a student has made a suicide attempt, that their parents should be told, their family should be told? Yes, we do. Well, why doesn't it happen now? Because it doesn't happen in lots of other cases. Oh, well, you know, ums and ahs, and maybe it's because there should be a trusted person rather than a parent. But again, that debate is taking place in Parliament. So we thought we'll go down the petition route. So next slide, Steve. And what we did is we drafted a Suicide Prevention Act, monitoring and coordinated action learning to minimise suicides with that framework approach. Interestingly, the process was, this was the original draft that Steve and I had, the process was that we had to submit it, and we had to fit into their word count on the site. We'll come to that. And then it went off through the system to a civil servant at the other end, who we had some to and fro with. And he suggested some changes. And he came back, the first change he came back with, he changed the word minimise to reduce. And we said, no, minimise, put minimise back in. We want a petition and a system that minimises suicides, not reduces them. And reduces them could be 1, couldn't it? Or 10%. You know, we want 90%. We want to move towards 0. So put minimise in there. And then on the next slide, Steve, we started specifying these changes coming out of our proposal. So that we had this package of these things that we put together with the National Suicide Prevention Office, all government departments and agencies to have their zero suicide plans and do annual progress reports to the National Office, the mandatory multi-agency local area suicide prevention partnership. Our civil servant took out the word mandatory. Interesting, isn't it? Just how these subtle changes are within the system. Enabling necessary data sharing, that's not breaching, as I said earlier, it's not breaching privacy or confidentiality. That's necessary data sharing of anonymized data or de-identified data. All public institutions, regulated industries or professions to have zero suicide frameworks. Again, it works. We know it's evidence-based, it works. Let's make sure it's right to the system. The mandatory suicide prevention. Now, again, I've seen comments in the chat here about, well, is it fair on GPs to expect GPs to do this, or pharmacists? Or, well, we can get into that debate and we can have an argument about that. But most of the people who've interviewed believe that there should be mandatory suicide prevention training for all health professionals and all emergency service personnel and all teachers. And it's actually in teachers' own best interests to have this training, because it helps them look after themselves. It helps them look after other teachers, as well as the staff, the pupils and the community, as a knock-on effect to community. And a lot of people gave examples like GPs, the training they get. Like every GP has mandatory training on CPR with annual checks and annual updates and audits. And when asked, how often do you use CPR? Last time was maybe 10 years ago. When was the last time somebody came in with a mental illness and was suicidal? Last week. So again, we've got to challenge the system in that respect. The impact assessments we've mentioned, I mean, there are various impact assessments that are used now, like environmental sustainability assessments. We're asking for a similar process, but for a suicide prevention impact assessment before new legislation or policy reviews. And interestingly, when we spoke to our contact at the Department of Health and Social Care about this kind of concept, this exact concept, he said that the department was actually favourably disposed, I love the language that civil servants use, favourably disposed to mental health impact assessments, but not suicide prevention impact assessments. So we know where we stand there. We know that we can push an open door in terms of mental health impact assessments, but we need suicide prevention. We need to push harder or find another way, friendly way of getting around this. Point 8, we put in our initial submission, and our civil servant took it out. And we said, why have you taken it out? And basically, the only conclusion we could come to was they didn't understand it. Didn't actually understand what that meant. All national and local suicide prevention initiatives to be informed by lived experience, which tells us a lot. We then had commitment to action on all factors contributing to suicides, because as we said earlier, it's multifaceted. That one was taken out, and partly because it's too general, and we're talking about an act, so we have to get into that, but we don't want to lose that in our final process in this. Ensuring appropriate support for those in suicidal crisis, community support. I mean, you all know what that kind of stuff means. Tackling loneliness and social isolation. There's actually the DCMS currently hosts a cross-departmental network to tackle loneliness and social isolation. It's already sitting there in parts of government, but it's not, again, it's not connected to the rest of it. Steve? We had all workplaces to meet standards for psychological safety and suicide prevention training. Again, our civil servant didn't quite struggling to get his head around that one. And we went for something more specific in the final version, which we'll come back to. We know that within the schools curriculum, the 3 dads have petitioned on, where we thought we'd keep it in there and keep the pressure on. Designing out suicide, the building regulations I've mentioned, and also making sure that counselling services and appropriate therapy services and support are available for all those who've experienced trauma and loss, including loss of suicide, because we know that they're at heightened risk, people bereaved by suicide. Now, we then took all of that, and Steve and I literally sat at the computer trying to fit this into the word count in the petition, parliamentary petition site, and we put those in. We toed and froed with our civil servant until we agreed on a set of wording. And the one at the bottom there you'll see is RIDA reporting. So that's the statutory reporting of fatalities and serious injuries and near misses at work that go up to the Health and Safety Executive within the Health and Safety Act. Initially, our civil servant came back and said, oh, but suicides is already in there. Suicides are already covered by the Health and Safety Act. We had to point out that suicides are specifically excluded from the Act, excluded from the RIDA reporting requirements, right? So obviously it went back in then. And when we've spoken to people in the construction sector and said, is there anything we can do to help you reduce the number of suicides in construction? That's one of the first things they say. Make that mandatory reporting for suicides, for suspected suicides, for major psychological injuries at work. And that will make a massive difference. So let's get behind this petition, for that alone, and hopefully all the other things above it.